What's going on? I'm Matt from Keep Making. Welcome back. Today I'm going to show you how I made my custom Sylvaneth Warband. Let's get to it.
Shall we begin?
Coming to you guys live from my new workspace studio area. So the lighting's not great, the sound is probably awful, and I apologize for that. So let's try to keep this brief. I am new to Warhammer. I've never played a game of Warhammer anything, but I've been drawn to Age of Sigmar. Obviously it's big within the miniature painting community. Warhammer in general is, and so I wanted to sort of try my hand at painting some Warhammer models, but also starting a group of Warcry, which seems like one of the easier games to pick up, maybe less intense than full Age of Sigmar or 40k or even Kill Team or something like that. So a group of friends and I are decided to play Warcry, and it's pretty good because you can get, you know, a modest amount of models. But I wanted to create a custom. I'm very drawn to the Sylvaneth or whatever, however you pronounce it. I don't know. The lore is really cool, which I dove into a little bit. And obviously those models are sick. I love anything dryad, tree folk type of thing. So that's why I chose this faction. But there was these really cool models from Lost Kingdom Miniatures that I wanted to go with and decided to. And I wanted to make my own sort of custom lore. So we'll talk about that a little bit later in the video. But for now, let's see how I went and prepared this project. So here are these beautiful models from Lost Kingdom Miniatures. I'm going to be using the smaller ones, these Shaolin Kodama, I think they're called, as my tree revenants, 5 tree revenants, 3 Kurnoth hunters, and an arch revenant is my rollout here for Warcry. So these smaller guys, I'll scale them up a bit if I want to use one for a Kurnoth hunter. This one with the flute, I'm going to be using as a Kurnoth bow hunter. And then here is my arch revenant. Obviously that's not how he ends up looking, so I'll show you how I did all that now. I pull them into my slicer, scale them down. They're about 35mm scale. I want them to be 28. So just scale them down, angle them how I want them to print off, and then we'll add some supports. And I load them into the slicer I actually use to do my print files and set a whole bunch of them and get to the printer. So I printed these on the first generation Elegoo Mars, gonna upgrade soon hopefully, but here's how they turned out. Took a while to print them and get all the supports right, but once they come off the printer, I gotta clean up any leftover supports as well as sand any of the pock marks that are sticking out. Once everything's sanded, I attach all the arms and pieces. And I use an activator to make them cure as quickly as possible. And once I had all the figures printed off, then I went through and got some of the bases. To remove the supports, I just dunk cleaned pieces of resin into some hot water and they just peel off. Now For my tree revenants, it was easy enough to just glue them onto some 35mm bases, but I'm gonna have to do a little bit more for my Kurnoth hunters. So I got these bigger cool mini or not bases that go around the figure. I chopped off some cork and just super glued it in place, and then I go around the edges of this cork and seal it with some liquid super glue. Printed off some more of those smaller bases and just combined them to make some more intricate pieces. Now, something I don't think I've covered on this channel before is the fact that I magnetized all of my miniatures. Well, most of them anyways. This makes it easier for priming. I have a metal prime stick that all my minis will just, stick to, and it makes it way easier for storage if you have those IKEA letter tray kits. So I just find some appropriately sized and weighted magnets and got to glue them into place. Now I'll go about adding some ground texture to these pieces using this AK Interactive Muddy Ground texture. And on the Kurnoth Hunters, I'm going to be going all over the cork just to blend in the 3D pieces to the cork. And then on the smaller tree revenants, I'm just going to hit it so they blends in the base to the 3D printed base. Now these were looking okay here, but I wanted to add even more visual interest, so I downloaded some of these mushroom files from my mini factory and printed off a whole boatload. Now the smart thing to do would have been to set these into that ground texture as it was drying, but I thought of it afterwards, so I had to come back in with some of that ground texture and apply it to the seams. So as I was saying before, this is going to be my Arch Revenant, but obviously he's missing something Arch Revenants have, and that's wings. So let's get this guy some wings. I borrowed some of them from Cobra Mode Minis, which I've been a supporter of since day one, not sponsored in any way, but I really love the wings on this figure here, and so I imported those into my slicer here, and I am not familiar with things like Blender or any sort of model making thing like that. The most I can do is Tinkercad, so the way I went about this was picking a pair of these wings, scaling them down to size, and then creating a merge of those wings and then supporting that merge and printing them off and then gluing them to this guy. So you'll see that all here.
Once I had the scaled down wings in place, all I really needed to do was delete the figure itself, and then I could combine those two wings and print that. Just line them up to be a little bit more perfect, and they were good to go. Once I had one down, it's easy enough to just duplicate it and then mirror it so that it's the reverse side. And surprisingly, they printed without issue. So sweet. So to attach the wings, I just use a pin vise and drill into the back of my Arch Revenant here and then super glue them in place. Now the last thing to do before I begin the painting process is to clean these models off. All of the activator I sprayed on them might interfere with paint adhering, so I just use some dish soap and hot water and just give them a rinse with an old paintbrush. Once they're all clean and dry, I can take them out and get them primed, and I'm just using this prime stick I made myself, and it's just got a piece of sheet metal flashing on top. That way all the magnets will adhere the models to the prime stick and I don't have to worry about them slipping away. So they all get primed, and once they're all done, I'm going to use some of this titanium buff from Golden and spray it through my airbrush to give a zenithal highlight. Brings out a lot of the details, lets me know what I'm painting, and some of that shading will show up in the final product.
Okay, so it's right here where I actually stopped filming the process. That way I can go ahead and paint the test model. I really wanted these to have a uniform look, but you know, I sort of got into paralysis in thinking about what I actually wanted to do with them. I think I had the idea in my mind of how they wanted to look, but then when it came to actually painting them, I sort of didn't know how to approach it. So I decided to do a test model, which I usually don't do. I usually just go guns blazing into it, but this time I decided not to, and I didn't want to film that because if I change anything along the way, which you'll see I did a lot with a lot of these other ones, but if I change anything along the way drastically, I wouldn't have to sort of document that process. So I'll show you now the test model. And so this guy I think came out really good. I really loved the way it looked, and going with that sort of white stone, that sort of natural marble look was something that was really important to me. I saw something in a gas station in a Tim Hortons drive-thru that I thought looked really cool. I'll show a picture of that now if I have one. And yeah, I just wanted to emulate that in a sort of way. And then, yeah, so I'll show you now how I went ahead and batch painted all of the rest of them using this test model as reference.
So now moving on to the base coat. I'm going to use some airbrush medium, some buff from Vallejo, and some Flow Aid. I'll put that all through my airbrush and then give every one of these guys a base coat to give them that mushroomy color, I guess. Then using that same buff from Vallejo, I'm going through and getting all the mushrooms. So I'm going to be using some speed paints later on, so what I want to do here is establish a base tone as well as a highlight underneath those paints I'm going to apply later. So I just do that by using a dry brush, getting most of the paint off of the brush and just hitting the highest raised areas of this model. That'll bring out all those details and edges, and that'll give us some variance after we apply the army paint or speed paints. To do the base color, I'm going to mix some black with some saddle brown, both from Vallejo. Mix that all up and just apply that all over the bases. And here's how we're looking so far. Now going in with some cork brown from Vallejo, I'm going to use the same dry brush and we're going all over the bases just to bring out a little bit more detail in that texture we applied before. And to give the ground formation a little bit more detail, I'm going to bust out the weathering pigments. And I use just sort of like a lighter brown color to give a sort of dirty, dusty finish to the bases. And once it's on the base, I just seal it in with some 50% isopropyl alcohol. Moving on to the stones now, I wanted to go, like I showed you before in that picture, with like a sort of marble or sort of opal sort of rock tone. So I'm mixing this metal medium to give us some sheen and shine and variance with this ivory color and just applying it all over the rocks. To add some shadow to that, I'm going to use this speed paint and the holy white to give some detail to the recesses of the rock. And then going back to a dry brush, I'm using this pure white from Vallejo just to pick out the highest sort of edges of the rock and bring in that highlight. Those are white, it's hard to pick up on camera, but they're looking pretty sweet. Then I go in with some beige brown, still from Vallejo, and I'm hitting all of the bonsai trees. Then with this Vallejo game color, this goblin green, I'm going to hit all of the sort of floral roots and stems of all these flowers. So now I'll give everything a whole wash. So I'm adding this Vallejo model wash, this green color, which is one of my favorites, with this Agrax Earthshade, another one of my favorite washes, mixing these together and then just adding a little bit of water to let it go a little bit longer and sort of dilute the strong tones of these two washes and applying that all over. So I apply this not only to the bases, but also to the figures themselves, given those strong sort of earth tones. You know, they are mushrooms, so I want them to sort of everything to blend in like it all came from the forest. So that's why we do that. So once I'm finished washing, I'm going in with this ivory. I'm going to use this to hit all of the mushroom sort of heads, all the fungus stuff on all the bases and the figures themselves. Because after this, we're going to go in with some of that sort of contrast speed paint. We want these details to really pop out. Now before we move forward, I'm just going to clean up all the areas that may have been oversprayed with the airbrush, so I go in with that titanium buff and do that. So to start, I'm going to do all their sort of loincloth leaf covering things, so I go in with this Absolution green and just apply it all over. think a common misconception is that speed paints or contrast paints are for lazy painters or for newer painters. I don't think that's true. They're very useful, thin paints that do a lot with one simple coat. And you know, if you're leaving them just as they come out of the bottle, that's fine too. I like to do a little bit more detail to when I apply them to models, but any stigma surrounding speed paints is, in my opinion, unwarranted. So don't fall into that. For the Kurnoth Hunters, you can see I did a little bit of a lighter green, and then on the tree, I'm going to go in with this small dry brush. I use some of that cork brown and really bring out some of the details in the tree bark. Here's how we're looking so far. As you can see, we're getting closer and closer to that test model. Next, I went in with some purple alchemy and hit all the flowers that were connected to what I painted with the goblin green. They're all hanging off the sides of the bases, and I thought the pink was really cool. I used some of that same pink to do the fungus on this specific model, and for the other models, I use a bunch of different colors of speed paint. While I have a speed paint out, I usually just go through and hit some of the mushrooms at the bottom of the base. That way I can start working towards having the uniform sort of colorful mushroom forest type vibe going on. So while I have those paints out, I just hit those mushrooms too. So before I was talking about changing my mind halfway through something, and the Arch Revenant was the best example of that. I thought I wanted him to have a multicolored fungal thing going on with the mushrooms on his head, and halfway through I just wasn't digging it, but kept going because I thought at some point it would all just come together, and it very much didn't. And then it broke. And I took that as the ultimate sign that I was moving in the wrong direction. So I went back in with that titanium buff, recolored all of the mushroom heads, and tried something else. If you saw the thumbnail, you know I don't stick with this Hyloid blue, but that was the next direction I took. And while I had it out, I actually began painting the wings of this guy. So these speed paints are really cool in that I wanted to try blending with them because they have the same medium in all of the paints. So I thought it'd be a really easy way to blend colors, and it did work out pretty well. So I started with this Hyloid blue, went into this, I think it's called Prismatic Bolt. And see there, it's just super easy to get a wet blend going of these two colors. From that Hyloid blue, I went into that Dweller Purple, Hive Dweller Purple I think it's called. This was a tougher blend to pull off. I had to come back with some Hyloid blue to make it all work, but in the end I really loved how these turned out. So once I was sure I hated that Hyloid blue, I went in with just some regular Vallejo paints and gave it a sort of pink finish. This is the one I ended up sticking with and really enjoy. Next step was to do all of the tree canopies for the bonsai trees. So I added some refractive green with some speed paint medium and just hit all of them. This really did a cool job of sinking into those recesses and giving a highlight as well. I was surprised mixing stuff with the speed paint medium worked so well. Just like the test model, I wanted all their staffs to be this cork brown color and then have like an OSL effect, but that changes later on in the process. This wasn't liking how it looked. Then I am going in with some khaki to do all the pants, I guess you could call them. They are pants, but I don't know why mushroom men have pants on, but I like them. And then I'm going to go in with this golden olive and highlight all of the vines that are coming from their heads, holding up their pants all over the place. That's what I do here. So I began starting that like OSL glowy end of the stick effect, and then this happened. Yeah, so that's not good. The Arch Revenant and this guy broke about 3 times each, and I just got sick of it in this guy's case, so I decided I would sculpt something into him. So I used some 2-part plumber's epoxy, similar to like a milliput or like a green stuff, just a little bit durable and dries a lot faster. So I glue him back to the base, and then I go about sculpting a sort of vine. This guy's got some druid vibes, so I thought it'd be cool that he was like summoning a big vine out of the ground. So I was rolling this out, and then so we tried that again and glued him to the base, got it activated in there and cured, and then began sculpting this around. Then as it's curing, I just use a hobby knife to sort of shape it into place. One of the problems with this plumber epoxy is it does dry really quick, so you don't have as much freedom as something with like a green stuff or milliput. Then once it cured a couple minutes later, I was able to start painting it. Another bonus to plumber's epoxy is that it takes paint, well at least it has for me, it takes paint really well, and I just paint it with that same golden olive that I use for the other vines. Now again, I didn't stick with this idea, but I just blend some of that cold white into the cork brown to get a nice transition. And then have the topmost part of it, that pure white, and then you could put some speed paint, which is another cool application, and it's like a very cheap and easy sort of like glowy effect. Going on to the models themselves now, the characters, the guys. I'm using some Screaming Salt to get my first layer of highlights in, and I'm just hitting all the raised areas, all the muscle groups, all the fingers, hands, stuff like that to bring out some of that detail. Then I'm going in with some Agrax Earthshade and just applying that between all of the layers, whether it's the fungi, the vines, or the muscle groups, or the whole body of this guy, even the pants. I'm getting some Agrax Earthshade there just to bring out some more detail and give it some weathering. The bonsai trees, as well as the loincloth skirt things, also get that same Agrax Earthshade. So to change those staffs, I just go back in with the cold white and I apply it all over where the cork brown currently is, and then I'm going to use that plasmatic bold speed paint to go over everything. And I wanted them to look sort of like the swords that the Sylvaneth usually use, and I think that turned out great. Then I'm going to start the eyes a little bit. We'll come back to them a little bit later, but I'm just using a dab of that same cold white and just getting the eyeballs here. And then what I do next is add some edge highlighting and some detail, just picking out some of the little nubs and stuff on these fungi pieces up top and around, and just giving them a little bit more visual interest. And on some of the fungus, I actually add a, like a shade tone. And, on this red one, I add some purple. On some of the other ones, I add like a darker blue just to give it a little bit more variance. Finish up with the Arch Revenant. I loved how the wings were looking, but it needed something else, so I went in with that same golden olive and gave all the raised areas on the wing a little bit of an edge highlight, and I think it really brought the wings together. Then I highlighted all the vines, adding some cold white to that golden olive and just hitting the topmost areas of them just to bring them out a little bit from the rest. And now coming back to the eyes, I just do a little drop of some speed paint, and then I'm going to go back in with the cold white and just do a little dot in the middle so we get that sort of glowing eye effect. Now before I move into basing, the last thing to do is just hit the rim of all these bases with a flat black, just so they have that uniform, nice crispy look we want from our Warhammer models.
Okay, real quick before we get into the basing, I'm going to talk a little bit about lore. I don't know a lot about Warhammer in general, I don't know a lot about Age of Sigmar, and I definitely don't know much about the old world. What I do know is that the Sylvaneth or Sylvaneth are led by someone named Alaria, who's like this deity who's like the protector of nature and all things good. But has become like extremely hyper focused on just protecting nature. So her moral compass, not really there, just protect nature, that's it. She rides a really sweet beetle. She's cool, but what she does is she awakens all these trees into beings that fight for her to defend the forest and nature. Very Princess Mononoke type vibes. And so my idea was, because she fights against this faction that are like these corrupted, fleshy monstrosity, blighted things, I don't know, that she might be losing the war at one point because her trees are being corrupted by this engine of blight and destruction in the Nurgle. And so she has to create a new type of creature to fight for her. So she turns to fungi, which we know in our world fungi are super weird and interesting and not quite plants, but sort of act that way. And there's some people who even speculate that fungi are from a different place in the universe and didn't originate on Earth, which is super interesting. I don't know how valid that is, but that's my idea. So instead of awakening a tree that would turn into a tree revenant, she awakens one of these spores and it's a spore revenant. I don't know. But my faction is called the Unblighted because they're going up against the Nurgle because they can't be corrupted as easily as, say, a tree would. So yeah, that's the lore I'm going with.
So we're going with a forest floor base, but the first thing I need to do is clean up this seam between the sculpted vine and the rest of the base. So my idea for this is to add some of that muddy texture, and then I'm also going to add some bits of cork, like the ones I used on the Kurnoth Hunter bases earlier, and I'm going to try to make it look like this vine is, you know, coming right out of the ground and busting out of it. So I stick the cork in place with the ground texture, and then I go back over it with some more ground texture. And I don't paint all of this ground texture because I want to look like it's a different material because it's coming out of the ground. It's not the sort of dry earth that's on top. So now I'm moving on to the flocking bit. So I'm going to use some woodland scenics, green grass, as well as some grass tufts from a few different companies. And I'm going to show you how I make my own type of flock. These materials are really cheap. This is reindeer moss from the dollar store, as well as some green tea from the dollar store. For just a couple bucks, you can make your own sort of forest ground textures. I throw these into a little coffee grinder and then just hit it a couple times. And then left with some pretty cool, granular textures for. I call this one the vine mix. I usually mix this with PVA and then apply it to get like a mossy, viney sort of thing. And then some shadow edge miniatures, grass tufts, as well as some Game Workshop arid grass tufts. To do my bases, I usually like to use a clear glue just because the white can leave a little bit of residue. So I apply that with a silicone brush, and then I just apply all of the textures onto the base. So I do shake off the excess so that everything can dry, but make sure you have something underneath so you can keep that and keep using it. Then I'm just applying some of those grass tufts. And then just picking out some of the details on some of those smaller mushrooms just to give a little more visual interest. And always remember, do the future version of yourself a favor and clean the workspace.
So right before we get into the final reveal, make sure you're giving this video a thumbs up. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel to see my future projects. I will be tackling the Everqueen at some point. Probably not my next video, but the one after that. My next video might be how I've moved into this new workspace area and how I've made it for myself. So stay tuned for that. But yeah, make sure you're liking this video and subscribing. And without any further ado, let's get to the final reveal.
Shall we begin?
So that'll do it for this episode, guys. Thank you so much for checking this out. Let me know what pieces of lore I'm missing, what you would add to the custom lore I made, maybe some things I missed along the way, or what you think of this project in general, what you think about proxy and Warhammer models. I know it's a little bit controversial, but yeah, thank you so much for checking this video. Make sure you gave it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, and keep making.